Hi there and welcome to another video. This is probably going to be a video that a lot of my subscribers are going to strongly disagree with, because I realize that I have a lot of subscribers, especially from the United States, and this is going to be somewhat of a cultural video too, that aren't as... I could probably describe them as a bit more moderate than myself. And I think this might have something to do with the fact that I come from a country under a political situation that is fairly similar to what they advocate, and I think it's shit. That is, I don't really think it's shit. I understand that it works fairly good in many areas, and that it's way better than, for example, what you have in a place like the United States of America, but, and I come from Norway, by the way, but I don't think it's as perfect as a lot of my moderate friends in the United States want to make it out to be, because I see a lot of the same problems that you have in the United States. For example, just to use a short example before I start the actual video and the actual points, one of the I don't know if he was a CEO, but one of the people that were fairly high ranking within the Statoil company, which is the state-owned, at least partly state-owned, state owns like 62% of the stocks in the company or something like that. One of the high-ranking people who work within that company is now going to retire, or going to retire soon. And when he retires, and I'm going to try to find the article in this so I can link it in the description box, when he retires, if I remember the numbers and the math correctly here now, he is going to get more out of retirement money, that is, in 1 year, you get this, in 1 year, than most normal people will get of working plus their retirement without throughout their whole motherfucking lives. Now that doesn't sound like some pretty nice utopian society to me. In fact, it sounds like the same brutal Darwinistic society that we see in, for example, the United States of America, simply covered up as social democratic. And I find this to be particularly funny because I used to be a social democrat. I come from a family of social democrats whom you could probably persuade into becoming socialist if you made somewhat decent argument. That is, I have people in my family who are socialists. I have people in my family who are self-proclaimed communists. It's no I don't think that's any secret. I think I've actually mentioned that in earlier videos, that I actually have members in my family that are communists, but not many, and most of them are moderate, and most people within Norway are even moderate, and most people see the problems that we have within Norway, and I don't have the same positive outlook on it as some of the people I know on YouTube do. As I said earlier, I prefer it over the American extremely brutal social Darwinistic predatorial exploitationary capitalism, but it's not perfect. And that's why I decided to make a video on social democracy and whether or not it's simply a moderate joke. But here's the thing, I decided, I said that I'll talk about the cultural aspect of this, because I think it does come down to something cultural, and that is that when you grow up in America, let's imagine the political compass here. You have the right, you have the center, and you have the left. And the problem is that the center of American politics is way, way, way to the right of, for example, the center in Norwegian politics. But it's changing in Norway too. I mean, the Labour Party has done many things in Norway in regards of half privatizing that, making that state company into a stock company where the state simply owns a majority, which to me is just state capitalism. It's just capitalism done by the state, which is not any better than capitalism done by capitalists, but it's slightly better because you can actually hold the state somewhat accountable through elections. But the thing is, when you grow up in the United States, the center and the whole political spectrum is way further to the right. So to be a social democrat, for example, to be a proponent of Norwegian politics, say you wanted to nationalize, at least partly nationalize, the oil companies in the United States, that's a pretty huge step to the left. Thus it will appear that you are way more radical than what you actually are, and because you haven't had policies and I think I can pretty safely say that you haven't had policies close to what, for example, the Norwegian state has at the moment, or at least used to have. You haven't had policies that are quite that left-wing. Thus, advocating such a position places you like further left than anything that the country really has really ever had at any point, and you appear to be very, very radical. Whereas in reality, the fact just happens to be that the society you live in is pretty far right-wing. So you appear much more radical, and it appears as, since your nation doesn't have a history of trying those policies, they seem, and I can understand from an American perspective, that Norwegian society, Norwegian living standards and our social rights must seem fairly attractive, and at least more attractive than the current American system. And I can understand that fully. Please don't misunderstand me. I'm not saying that it's shitty in Norway or anything like that. To the contrary, it's actually quite decent. But politics, as I've said before, is not about finding the least worst policy, but the best policy, trying to aim for something better. And this is where I'm going to get into the cultural aspect of coming from Norway. Because when you come from Norway, the policy is a bit more to the left again, at least in regards to how it is in the United States of America. And therefore, and I apologize in advance because I know this will be a shit long video and probably fairly boring, and therefore, people like myself who have grown up with a social democratic system, who have grown up in a society that respects social rights more, where people have more power in terms of being fairly represented by the government, for example, in terms of more power through unions, in terms of more equal wages, for example, in terms of at least higher wages relative to the cost of living, then it places you in a system where that's the norm. If we were to lose healthcare in Norway, at least if it didn't happen gradually the way it's going to happen now, at least after 2013, when we will get a right-wing government, most likely, and basically social rights, and even under the Labour Party, social rights will drift more and more away. We need to be more competitive, they say. So, you know, if you were to remove healthcare overnight, for example, in Norway, I think you'd had a fucking... Well, I don't really think you had a revolution, but you would most certainly lose the election after the next 4 years. So, of course, the spectrum is further left here, but the positive thing about that is that when the spectrum is further left, we have the capability of looking at it from a more left-wing perspective and judging whether it is as utopian as, for example, an American like Michael Moore makes it out to be. And it's not. There are problems with it, and it tends to be the same problems that you see with the American system. Really, it tends to be the same problem as you see with capitalism in whatever form or shape it has in any part of the world, which is the same kind of exploitation, the same kind of greed, the same kind of systematic lack of care for normal people, and the same kind of ideas that you can just pull yourself out of poverty and become a rich, successful human being simply by working hard. And these ideas are infiltrating Norway too, and all of the world, actually, at least all of the Western world, quite rapidly. And they bring with them some problems, and that is that when we actually believe that, then we no longer have the needs for safety nets. We no longer have the needs for things like public schooling, public healthcare. It's all about just working hard. So, what's my point here? Well, my point that I'm trying to get to is exactly what is the issue I have with social democracy. Because I was a social democrat, actually, when I started out on YouTube, and then I became a socialist, and then I became a social democrat again. And this happened it's quite some time ago now. I think it was while I was making those videos about banks. And it's not the ones that you'll find if you go back in the list of videos that I've uploaded, but it's the ones way before that, like right after I stopped making videos on religion. So, yeah, I've switched sides quite a lot. up until quite recently, when I became more interested in the actual facts behind it, instead of just saying, yeah, this might seem a bit too radical for me, and just backing out of it, like I had done for quite some time before that, and like most other people actually tend to do. When you talk to them, they bring up this thing, we need a compromise. No. No. I mean, okay, a compromise might be better than a predatorial, social Darwinistic, exploitationary kind of system, but you can't have a compromise with someone who is not interested in having a compromise with you. You can't have a compromise with someone who will do everything to violate the things you came up with when you had that compromise, and who will try to do everything to destroy and dismantle whatever you have built up. And that is what we see financial elites and those with a lot of capital power trying to attempt to do in Norway too. Dismantle the system of welfare that exists and really take over things in terms of privatization and in terms of lowering taxes and things like that. So my issue here is that social democracy seems to be just a temporary solution until it actually breaks down, because you have to remember that Norway in historical time hasn't been social democratic for that long. Even if you take it all the way back to the post Second World War period with Einar Gerhardsen and that time, to put it that way, it's not even 100 years ago. So I mean, it's in historical time it's literally nothing. So if you say that, well, it's worked out so far, anything can work out that far. Really, anything can work out that far. And the major problem with it is that social democracy does not outcompete the modern tendencies of globalization. Today, it's cheaper for large companies to outsource their jobs from, for example, Norway to some other third world country, and the social democratic solutions to these problems are non-existent, because you have two ideas. You can say that, yeah, we're going to tax foreign goods at a shit high rate, but I think that's unfair, because things that are produced in, for example, China by Chinese people, if for example China produced something, and if the workers at that company where they produced this wasn't being exploited, and if it was fair production under a fair economic system, then it's not unfair if they sell that to Norway. That's not the problem really with globalization and the issue of outsourcing jobs. So the social democratic solution to this actually tends to be the statement that I think I said in the beginning of the video, that we're not competitive enough. We need to be more competitive. What that actually means, what that's actually a code word for, is we need to destroy social and economic rights, and we need to destroy labor rights, and we need to become more competitive, which is just a nice way of saying you're fucked to anyone who has a job, especially a job within, for example, the field of production. So that's really the issue, that it doesn't solve these problems. It doesn't solve the core problems of the sort of like, it doesn't solve the core problems of the situation that we're in at the moment, which seems to be a systematic exploitation of normal working class people. And in regards to that, I think social democracy is imperfect, because it doesn't solve these problems. And when it doesn't solve these problems, it tends up doing something that that's even worse. And that is that, due to the regulations, restrictions, and taxes that exist in capitalism, it makes it less attractive, and this is simply true, you can't deny this, it makes it less attractive to run huge businesses, which again gives the huge businesses more of an incentive to outsource jobs. And the typical response to this, even from a social democratic perspective, is to drop the social democratic policies, because they will simply lead to more outsourcing of jobs, and you need to accept the more right-wing predatorial exploitationary capitalist policy to get the jobs back. And then you can try the social democratic policy again, but it's going back and forth between two policies, one of which is awful, which is the predatorial social Darwinistic capitalist policy, and the social democratic policy, which is slightly less awful but still very, very, very flawed. So yeah, it doesn't solve these key issues. And the reason why I call it a joke is because it pretends that it solves these issues. It pretends, for example, when Labour Party politicians pretend that, oh, we're all about power to the working class and we're all about equality. No, you're not about equality when there are people within the country making 250 times more than other people. You're not about equality when we have a housing market within Norway at this point that is actually fairly unregulated. We have a housing market that is now getting so fucking ridiculous that the costs of buying something are so high that normal people almost can't afford it anymore. And that is almost can't. We can still, but almost can't. And the prices are no longer anywhere near relative to the actual costs of producing it. You can't claim to be pro-working class and pro-equality and pro almost a neo-socialistic policy when you allow all of these things to happen. And that's my issue with social democracy, is that it promotes this simplistic idea that capitalism is perfect if we just regulate it. Well, what if capitalism doesn't want to be regulated? That is, what if the capitalists don't want to be regulated? Then they will make every single possible action to avoid that and to make the state change its policy. And here's the other side of that story. When jobs are being outsourced, they're being placed somewhere else, in, for example, places like Singapore. That gives rapid economic growth to certain nations that get these jobs. Sometimes they end up being exploited, but overall, due to the massive amounts of new income that these countries have, it makes the economy of the country grow rapidly. So they're almost stealing what other nations have created. And here's the thing: even if you manage to make all nations social democratic, it would only work if all nations remained social democratic for all of eternity without ever changing it. Because if one of these nations changed it, then it would be more attractive to place your business there. The business would be placed there, and the nation that gets its jobs outsourced would have some problems, and it would have to change its policy. Maybe it would open up for a more socialist, more predatorial, capitalistic policy, and then all of a sudden that becomes more attractive, and jobs were moved from somewhere else, and eventually the jobs are being placed where it's easiest to exploit people again, and you're back to scratch, you're back to zero, you're back to the problem. And even if we managed to keep all nations throughout the world social democratic for all of eternity, there are still problems, and within social democracy, I still think there's a problem of exploitation within Norway, for example. I still think that there are people being exploited, and there are people who have way more than other people. There are people who live in poverty in Norway. It's a complete and total myth that everyone is happy and everyone has easy lives. Most people actually feel that they work quite a lot, or a fair bit, and most people actually feel that we don't have some sort of perfect equality society that's almost utopian, the way, for example, a person like Michael Moore puts it. So the problems that you have with the predatorial, exploitionary, capitalistic system of the US is the exact same problems that we have with the somewhat predatorial, somewhat exploitionary, somewhat capitalistic system of Norway. And social democracy doesn't solve that. Social democracy becomes a moderate joke, because essentially it ends up destroying itself, and then it ends up strengthening itself again by destroying itself. And it's just so pointless, because I always laugh when I hear these debates between moderate left-wingers when they come up with all these absurd solutions to how we can regulate our way out of the crisis, and how we can fix everything, and how we can live in some sort of half-utopian society with all these perfect regulations. And they don't even dare to ask the question if it's necessary to maintain this system. No No one dares to ask that question, yet it's the simplest of all questions. It's simpler than coming up with tons and tons of regulations. And I'm not talking about what people think I'm talking about in terms of nationalizing every single fucking company. That's not the thing. I'm not talking about nationalizing the local restaurants and nationalizing the local coffee shops and nationalizing everything, but it's in regard to shifting the economic system we have today, replacing the economic system we have today that is, even in Norway, largely based around private enterprises, and this whole new thing, well, it's not particularly new, but let's call it the new thing of state-owned stock companies, which, for example, like Statoil, which means that it's a fucking private company, the state just owns the majority of the stocks, but it still operates as a capitalist company. So to me, it becomes a predatorial version of capitalism. It's just state capitalism instead of capitalism done by unaccountable organs. So yeah, it's just so no one really. It seems like no one, at least not within the political moderate spectrum, dares to ask if it's necessary to maintain the system, and if we can't replace it with a system that is more largely based on democratic ownership over the means of production. And what that means can vary in terms of restaurants. I'm not a huge fan of state-owned restaurants or state-owned cafes. In fact, I think it's unnecessary, and I think it would lead to a lot of unnecessary bureaucratic costs. But I'm in favor of cooperatives at that level. And it's not... It's not that I think that social democracy is awful, and I don't want, and this is going to be the last point, and I don't want to make it out as if we have some sort of awful situation here in Norway. In fact, we're one of the best countries, we are the best country, at least according to the UN, to live in when we look at the living standards. But if we're going to look at it that way, it becomes completely becomes completely ridiculous, because that's all relative to the living standards of other nations. We have to ask, is there something we can do to make it even better? And at the moment, it seems like, though a lot of politicians are willing to ask that question, they're not willing to look at the possible answer that maybe there is something better than capitalism.